Aloha and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Got Your Six podcast. This six-question podcast brings together high performers to share their methods, strategies, and ideas, delivered in an informative and, most importantly, actionable way that'll help you lead yourself and those around you from the battlefield to the boardroom. Coming to you every episode, I'm your host, Tony Nash. And into the breach.
Nothing mentioned on this podcast is an endorsement or opinion of the Department of Defense.
I got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. I got your six.
All right, Sixers. This is another episode where I have the opportunity and complete pleasure to talk to one of my dear friends, Tyler Gordy. You heard the bio we've already covered. I don't want to really go into that anymore. It's time for Tyler to share his story, where he's been, what he's doing, what he's up to. So Tyler, you have this very unique path where you went from the enlisted side through West Point, then back into the Army, then on to Harvard Business, and now doing wonderful things in the corporate world. There's got to be at least one thing, though, that you implement daily from your time in the military. What would that be?
Yeah. Well, first, Tony, thanks for having me on. It's good to be back in your presence. When I saw that question, I was kind of thinking about what's the one thing that I do that I think is probably the most important thing in my day. And I was thinking about kind of the exercise component, getting out and exercising and trying to stay fit. But then I was also thinking about this other piece of my health that I think is so critical, which is sleep. And actually good sleep doesn't start with 8 o'clock at night. It actually starts with 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning, and the sunlight that you get first thing in the morning. Your retina actually has these cells that sense first morning light, and that actually sends a signal to your brain, and that sets your circadian rhythms in motion. So every day I wake up and I get 45 minutes of sunlight. Sometimes I walk, sometimes I run, but I get that morning sunlight. I don't wear sunglasses. It's not like I'm in my car. I'm outside. I'm exposed directly to that sunlight. And I've seen such incredible health benefits by maintaining that practice. One, my sleep is deeper. Two, I'm really tired at night. By 10 o'clock, I'm ready to go to bed. And then also it feels like I'm less stressed. I'm more able to be resilient and deal with whatever the day brings. And it just kind of sets the tone for me. So I learned that in the military. I didn't know I was learning it. It was like, hey, get up, get out of bed, 4 a.m., you're going to go do PT. And I didn't really understand the importance of that. I'm not even sure the Army understood the importance of it at the time. But there's so much research that has come out recently that has shown that initial sunlight is so critical for your sleep, which your sleep drives your overall health. And so that really is the one thing that I do.
I am glad I'm not alone in that, right? So I do about 10, 15 minutes where I'll go outside. But so you said you either walk or run. So when you wake up, you're going right from the bed. You've already probably laid out your clothes or something like that, out the door and into the world. Yeah,
I actually wake up and then meditate, and then I'll go out and get my sunlight. Yeah, so I'll walk or I'll run. I actually live right across the bridge from Georgetown. So I usually will hop on the Key Bridge, go into Georgetown, run through Georgetown, and then come back and take a shower, start my day.
What's the hardest part of doing that when you wake up and like just going outside? Do you find any resistance?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I mean, the resistance for me is always to get on my email and start checking my email first thing in the morning. And I think it's important to stay disciplined and to not do that and to have that kind of 35 to 45 minutes of time away from that. So you can focus on just those few things to kind of set the tone for the rest of the day. But that is my natural inclination, is to roll over, open up my phone and immediately start scrolling through my emails and answering emails. And I try not to do that because I think it's a bad habit. It gets you focused on work and not focused on the task at hand. And I think it's just better to kind of get started with those two basic things: meditation, morning sunlight. And if I'm doing a run or something like that where I haven't done trained legs, the prior day before, then I'll run. If not, I'll just go outside and I'll walk for 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it says a lot about you. One, as a leader, like you recognize you need to be able to take care of yourself first, set the conditions so you can go on to do things throughout the day. And then two, you recognize where those faults are, because we are human at the end of the day. and you like, hey, I know what I want to achieve going forward. I can't let this like quick dopamine hit of like checking my emails and feeling, the importance of, sending a response at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. whenever you wake up. That's super powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I learned that unfortunately the hard way. I learned that through burning out and just not having those good habits to maintain my health. And I reached a point, it was actually our first year at West Point when I was a first captain. And I was just, by that point, I had worked myself. By the time I went into senior year at West Point, I had kind of worked myself to the bone. And I unfortunately I felt like I didn't have a ton to give that year in terms of energy. And really just from a leadership perspective, I felt like I'd already reached the point of burnout. And I had to learn those habits really through failure and recognizing that I hadn't taken care of myself, both my physical health and my mental health while I was at the academy. And I had to put those habits in place. And I know that if I deviate from that path, my health starts to slip. So I stay very disciplined with it.
So, speaking on failure, where do you think, or what has been one of your greatest failures that's ultimately led to your greatest success? Like you said, you were leading the Corps of Cadets, the premier, military institution in the country. I'm always, and you and I will always, rep USMA over the other service academies. We still will show them love, but yeah. So where do you think, what would that failure have been?
Yeah, I have a couple. I mean, one was the one that I talked about where I felt like I wasn't particularly effective in that role my first year. So that was a failure that I look back on. I learned a ton from. One, I learned about the kind of the limits of institutional change, the challenges that come with changing an institution that's over 200 years old. But the one that I look back on most recently is actually my journey outside of Harvard Business School, going in and trying to acquire a company. I actually spent 18 months to it, and I didn't get a company. I didn't close a deal. So this path that we had talked about, entrepreneurship through acquisition, you raise a pool of capital from investors, or you take your own savings and you go out and you try to acquire a business, and then you take over that business and run it as the CEO. And you're essentially a one-man or one-woman private equity shop. And you're doing all of the deal sourcing. You're doing all of the diligence. You're working with the banks to raise the debt. You're working with investors to raise the equity capital. And it's a really challenging thing that you have to do. And you have to keep all of those plates spinning at once, because if the funnel dries up on the kind of the deal side while you're doing diligence, then you have to go back and start all over and try to find new deals. I found it to be incredibly challenging, incredibly isolating. You're alone. You're not working with a team. It was the first time that I hadn't worked with a team in years, particularly as a leader. I was doing it all by myself, and really my success or my failure was entirely on my shoulders and not on my team's shoulders. And I got 18 months in. I had a deal under LOI, which is letter of intent. You've signed a letter of intent, and you're essentially saying that you're going to buy this business. And it wasn't a huge business. It was a $12 million business. It was in Houston, Texas. And I was going to buy this business and go run it. And I got down right to the end, and I decided to walk away from it for a number of reasons. There were some issues with the business that I couldn't get comfortable with. There were some issues with the sellers that I couldn't get comfortable with. And I decided at that time it wasn't the right thing to do to move forward with the process. And I had spent a ton of my own money. I was in debt up to my eyeballs. I at the time I probably had $50,000 worth of personal debt that I had put into this business trying to get this deal across the line. I was self-funded at the time. And I didn't get the deal done. So I left. And one of the reasons why I decided to leave was because the company that I'm running now was owned by a private equity firm called TA Associates. They're a Boston-based middle market private equity firm. And they had bought the business for, I think it was close to $120 million pre-financial crisis, 2008. And then when the financial crisis happened, the business was tied to the housing market. The housing market collapsed, as everyone knows, and the business contracted with the collapse. It didn't go under. It was always financially solvent, but it did contract at the time. And it I wouldn't say that it was reaching the point of a financially stressed asset, but it was certainly declining. And TA decided that they were going to get rid of the business and sell it. And a financial firm, Kingsway Financial Services, which is a publicly traded holding company, acquired the business. And they were looking for a new CEO to come in and to replace the outgoing CEO and rebuild the leadership team, put a growth strategy in place, put an operating model in place, and come in and grow the business. And I got lucky. I mean, I really did. I got lucky. I threw my name in the hat. I heard about the opportunity, threw my name in the hat, got hired as the president, chief operating officer, and then came in 2018 and then stayed in that role for 8 months and then was promoted to the CEO position after 8 months. And then I've been doing that ever since. So I didn't acquire a business, but somehow I landed in this role. And I think, it certainly was a failure. I walked away with $50,000 in personal debt that I had to pay off. But I came into this role and this has been a tremendous learning opportunity for me. And so far it's been a success. So.
You and I both know, though, that luck doesn't play a factor in any of this because of all the hard work you did in preparation for the Houston company and showing, you, like you said, you had to be a one-person show. So you were able to understand the whole side of it, not from an academic side like you were in grad school, but like real world skin in the game kind of perspective. And then to go and say, I've done this, and people automatically, like, they pick up on that, like, pretty quickly. At least from what I've seen. Yeah, I think so. It was one of those things. I look back on it, and certainly my time in the military had prepared me from a leadership perspective. But running a company, a standalone company with a profit and loss statement where you're having to generate revenue and control your expenses and control the cash conversion cycle and ensure that your customers are paying and you're paying your vendors. It's just a different beast, and it's a different type of anxiety. It really is. And stress. There's just something that comes along with that, particularly when the firm that bought my business, and this is very typical for acquisitions, they're leverage buyouts. So the deal has kind of two sources of capital. One is the debt capital that comes from the bank, and the other is the equity capital that comes from the owners or the investors. And the debt capital comes with covenants and restrictions. And if the business isn't performing well and you trip those covenants, the bank can seize the business. So it's a very scary feeling when you get into this thing, particularly as someone like myself. I had never ran a company. In fact, I had never had a civilian job as an adult outside of Harvard Business School. I went and did this entrepreneurial thing, and it was not a success for me. And then I come into this business and I'm running this multi-million-dollar company, and we're publicly traded, right? So we're dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, and our holding company's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So we're dealing with all the nuances of that. And it was incredibly challenging. It has been incredibly challenging. But I think the one thing that I've always kind of gone back to and relied on as a foundation for me is the blocking and tackling leadership experiences from my time at West Point and as an NCO, and then at my time as an officer in the Army. Those things really set the foundation for me. And those are the things that I feel like people in the private sector have the hardest time grasping, are those intangible leadership qualities. And, I'll always be grateful for that experience and the trajectory that set me on. That's interesting that you're leveraging so far back because of those lessons learned, back in the early 2000s that you still implement on a daily basis. Has there been along the way, like some sort of course or a book or some video that you also use, or kind of, like you said, you go back to the blocking and tackling all the time. Is there another source you pull from as well?
So from a leadership perspective, there's a number of books, particularly when I'm talking about the role that I'm in now. There's a number of books that I think are really good. One is 4 Disciplines of Execution. Great book. I believe it's written by Stephen Covey's son, and it's not an overly complex book, but it talks about the fundamentals, which is focusing on wildly important goals, acting on lead measures, keeping a balanced scorecard, and creating a cadence of accountability. Those 4 things, if you do them correctly, and when we talk about focusing on wildly important goals, it's 2 goals at one time, no more than 2 goals. You pick those 2 goals, you focus on those 2 things, and then you execute on those 2 goals. We use that in my company. We use it as part of a broader operating model. We also use, it's kind of a hybrid of Danaher's policy deployment system and Toyota's Hoshin Kanri, where we take, the vision that I have for the organization, translate that vision into a strategy, and then take that strategy, put it into an operating plan, and then we execute on that plan through this 40X book. And I have found that book to be probably the most important tool on executing, not necessarily on strategy development. It's a different topic, but just on going out and executing on the plan, it's really, really helpful. And we do it on a weekly basis. We have a 30-minute meeting every Tuesday. We never miss it. Sometimes I'm not a part of it because I'm traveling or I'm a part of another meeting. The company still does it. We focus on the goals that we had for the prior week. If we didn't get them done, we'll dig into them. We'll diagnose, kind of go through the 4 W's, the 4 Y's. Why didn't this happen, until you get to the root cause of the problem. And then we'll take the next set of goals and we'll line them up for the next week. We'll assign responsibility for those goals, and then we go out and execute. Very simple. That's a great book. Principled Leadership is another one. And, I think one of the great quotes in Principled Leadership is around trust and the importance of trust. And trust is really kind of comprised of 2 components, character and competence. And you have to have both of those things in order to trust someone and to empower them. And as you and I know, empowering people is probably, it's one of the most important things that you can do as leaders is to give them that trust and give them the what and not the how, and allow them to go out and use their creative imagination to get things done on their own. So that's another great book.
It shows, right? Like it always comes down to the fundamentals. And like you said, that trusting of your people that they're going to go and do things. They're going to obviously need some limits and stuff like that. That's why you only have 2 goals each week that you constantly come back to. And that
leadership.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, leadership is one of those things, though. It's really easy in theory. It's really challenging in practice. And I think you're right. The fundamentals are what people should focus on. It's what I try to focus on. But even though I've known about these things for years, I still struggle with it.
Yeah. And then how do you kind of recalibrate, right? Because like you said, that's to be vulnerable and say like, I struggle, because we all do. How do you find yourself recalibrating, going back to those fundamentals? Because things can get really complex really quickly.
Yeah, I listen to people. I seek feedback often, and I listen to people, and I take their feedback very seriously. I do it through a number of ways. I do it through anonymous feedback. I ask the questions: what should I stop doing, start doing, and continue doing as a leader? And I'll get feedback through that mechanism. I do a weekly meeting with the entire executive team, and I get feedback through them. They're very candid, and that's one of the things that we have focused on. Ray Dalio calls it idea meritocracy. I've heard the term called collective intelligence before, but from a guy that served on the enlisted side and then as an officer, I think of it in the same way as a PL going in and listening to the NCOs on the ground who have the experience and the knowledge and who can tell you, what a compass is when you don't really know and you don't know how to use one. I listen often, and I think that helps me really recalibrate and get back on task. And Stanley McChrystal has a quote that a leader isn't good because they're right. They're good because they're willing to learn and to trust. And that's something that I try to do every day. And one of the questions that you had talked about is, how are you better today than you were tomorrow? And for me, it's focused on that. I'm just trying to learn and to trust and to hear my people out.
We're going to get back to that question because I want to deep dive into that in a little bit.
All right.
But you talked about listening. There's also another piece that kind of you went without saying. It's like actioning what you're told, right? Or actioning the feedback that you receive, because we can all receive feedback and like internalize and be like, oh, okay. But to then implement what we learn is a completely different thing.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I just had an example of that where I was given some feedback and I was kind of asking those questions, but it was more centered around what should we stop doing? I was hearing kind of rumblings that we were focused on too much stuff. We were trying to do too much. And you hear often that businesses don't die from starvation. They usually die from indigestion, where you're just trying to take on too much. And I think we had reached that critical point where people were getting to the point where they were kind of experiencing burnout, and we needed to adjust. And it's like, okay, these people have given me this information. Now, how do I go back and actually implement the feedback that they've told me? And that can be really challenging.
So then would you say that's a new skill that you're trying to implement, is like not trying to dial back and like leverage? Or is there another one that you've recently kind of tried to pick up?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a big one. I think the thing that I'm consistently trying to work on always is empowering people, and I think that starts with hiring the right people that are kind of worthy of that trust that we talked about. From my perspective, the most important thing you can do as a business leader, which you don't really do as a military officer, is hire the right people. Make sure you have the right people on the bus. It's a really different concept than when you come into a platoon or you come into a company and you inherit the NCOs. And when you say in the Army, oh, we fired so-and-so, well, you didn't really fire him. You just moved him to the S4 shop or the motor pool or something like that. Right. Firing people in the private sector is really challenging, because that for the most part, these are really good people and they're working very hard for you. And this is their livelihood. And their families are tied to this, and their futures are tied to this job. And when you recognize that you don't have the right person on the bus, you have to let them go. But I think at the end of the day, it's ultimately the right thing to do, the less cruel thing to do. I think it's more cruel to keep someone in a position where they can't succeed. And so you either try to move them into a position within the organization where they can, or you let them go. But it's incredibly challenging to do that. And when you talked about the thing that I'm trying to do, I'm always trying to figure out ways to make sure that I'm trusting people and empowering them. And I think that starts with hiring the right people that are people of high character and competent.
Right. And like you said, it forces you then to make sure you're messaging the right things to then attract the right people. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy. That process is not easy. And you're also trying to make sure during the process that these are the people that you need, that they have the talents and the skill set and the leadership capacity to come into your organization and to affect changes in the way that you need them to be affected. So I think it's by far the leader's most important job. It's also, I think, the most difficult job.
Yeah. And like you said, as the leader, right, one thing sometimes leaders don't do well is reflection, right? So if we look back at the last 5 years, what would be something that you've taken away that has like dramatically improved your life to help you get to where you are now? So from like coming out of Harvard Business School to today, what would you say that's been?
Yeah. I think I have really come to look at suffering in a very different way. And this is a little bit of a deep response here, but yeah. I used to view suffering as something that was really bad and that I wanted to avoid. It's like you're in Ranger School and you're hungry and you're tired and you're wet and you're like, I want to get out of this. I don't want to suffer anymore. I want to get home and get away from this experience. I remember when I got done with Ranger School, I would eat a dozen Krispy Kremes and then a large Pizza Hut pizza for dessert on top of that, because I had suffered so much, right? So I associated the suffering with pain and something that I needed to avoid. And I had done that for pretty much most of my life. And as I've gotten a little bit older, I've come to recognize that there's a lot of learning, really profound life lessons that are centered around our suffering. And it's easy, I know, for someone that's literally kind of sitting in a glass tower to say that, like, oh, suffering is good, suffering's grace. But when you compare that to people that are experiencing starvation in a third world country, or have lost a family member, or who are actively engaged in war. But I think of suffering as an opportunity to grow and to learn. And there's a guy that I really admire. He's a spiritual leader. His name is Ram Dass. He was a former Harvard psychology professor that went off to India and kind of started practicing the Eastern religions. I would say he's kind of a Buddhist, but he incorporates a lot of the Eastern philosophies into his practice. And he says that suffering is the sandpaper of our incarnation. And it does its work in shaping us spiritually. It's the sandpaper that kind of really rubs down the burrs and the spurs and really kind of shapes us. And I think that's true. And he also says that suffering is grace. And I do believe that there is grace in the suffering because of the spiritual growth that comes from these experiences.
I'm sorry. I had to take a moment because that was so powerful. Because like you said, we take these lumps and we take these hits and they're suffering and we get banged up. But like, as you use that sandpaper, you're allowed to reshape the mold of, the object, right? So that ding or dent, wherever, it now becomes part of that story. And you can leverage that in shaping the future. That's so incredible. Yeah.
There's, you often hear about post-traumatic stress, but there's also this thing called post-traumatic growth. And for anyone that's experienced post-traumatic stress and gone through that, it's incredibly challenging and very difficult, particularly when you're a young person and you go off to war and you see the horrors of war, and then you come home and you have to integrate back into society and digest that. It can be profoundly difficult, but when you go through it, you come out of it on the other side, and there are really deep lessons that you learn through those experiences that you carry throughout your life. And I think that's what that kind of concept of suffering as grace is centered around. Is we're here on this earth for a purpose. And part of that purpose is to grow spiritually. And it's unfortunate that that's the way that it happens for us, but through the suffering, I think is where we achieve the greatest spiritual growth. So that's I think the one thing that I've learned, really come to understand over the last 5 to 10 years, is that while these painful experiences are things that we feel like we want to escape and get away from, that actually if we kind of sit in the experience and are present in the experience, there's deep learning opportunities.
So we've talked about success. We've talked about failure. We've talked about sitting in suffering. Now, Tyler Gordy, how are you? You've hinted at this, but I do want to ask you directly. How are you better than yesterday?
Yeah, I think, it's kind of what I said earlier. I'm trying to learn, listen and learn and recognize that I don't have all the answers, and that lessons come from a number of different places. Life lessons come from a number of different places, and just really trying to stay humble and be willing and open to learn those lessons regardless of where they came from.
And that's an incredible point to talk about, right? Where you constantly are able to do that and learn and grow. So Tyler, where can people reach out to you? Where are you most active if people have questions about many of the different things we talked about? Recovery from PTSD, all that other. Go ahead.
Yeah, LinkedIn. LinkedIn's the easiest one. I have an email registered with AOG. It does come to me, but I get so much spam that sometimes it's hard to keep track of all the emails. But if you reach out to me on LinkedIn and send me a message in my inbox, generally I'll be able to see that and respond. The one downside, I would say, of being a CEO, if there is one, is that people are always trying to sell you a product. So I get a lot of messages from vendors who want us to try this new product or software. And sometimes it's hard to kind of sort through those things. But certainly if I see a grad and they're reaching out, I'll respond. If they're not a grad and they just say, hey, I heard from you on this podcast. Can we chat? I love chatting with veterans. I love to help veterans, particularly people that are interested in the entrepreneurial path. That really excites me. And but yeah, absolutely, they can reach me there.
I mean, look what you did for Lester Adcock, the 92-year-old Korean War veteran. Like, that's super powerful. We're going to link that story in the show notes. Tyler, thank you for your time. Go ahead. Oh,
I was just going to say, Lester, believe it or not, he was my recruiter's dad when I enlisted. He was my recruiter's dad. Yeah. And the guy that put me in the Army when I enlisted, I've stayed in contact with him. He was a great guy. He was in 75th himself. He was a RIP instructor there. He was in 275. And his dad was a Korean War vet and went through some tough times, and we were able to raise that money and help him out. So appreciate you bringing that up.
Absolutely. It's an incredible story. I'm glad we were able to, because I wanted to make sure we talked it. Tyler, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for, and
my pleasure.
Thank you for having our six.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I don't know what you've been told, Sixers, but the lawyers would like us to remind you that the views, opinions, and comments expressed on the Got Your Six podcast are solely those of the hosts or guests, to include current and previous Department of Defense employees, and should in no way be considered the opinions of or endorsements on behalf of the Department of Defense or any of its components, divisions, contractors, or other current and previous staff members.